Hi everyone, this is Arjun from Factual.
Hi, and this is Jill Soley.
Welcome to Factual Fridays, where we discuss some of the important news of the past week that you may have missed, and particularly looking at it from multiple different angles so that you have all the facts and can reach your own conclusions.
All right.
So what should we talk about today?
Well, I guess the topic of the day is the gender pay gap.
Yeah, that's right.
There are a couple things going on there, right? Biden signing something that encourages...
That's right. It's not a very strict executive order.
companies to not ask for prior pay. There's also this open initiative. I guess that a bunch of CEOs of pre-IPO companies are agreeing to make sure that they're paying, make sure that they have equal pay within their companies.
That's right.
Is any of that going to do anything? I don't know.
Yeah. This was a really good topic in that there's a lot of differences between how political left and political right see this issue. At a high level, I think everyone agrees that any sort of rampant sexism that discriminates and unfairly pays one side is just bad. It's wrong. I don't think it's a whole lot.
Does everyone agree to that? I don't know, but I agree with you, certainly.
Well, so the question, we ran a poll on this and we asked people, can the gender pay gap be closed? And for those of you who don't know, the Factual runs these daily polls, and we have a pretty good cross-section of the U.S., readers in all 50 states across all demographics, pretty evenly balanced, conservative, liberal, moderates, etc. So it was a near split vote, where half saying, slightly more than, I think 45% saying no, it can't, and then roughly about the same saying it can. But what was interesting is people arguing about how significant the gap was and what's driving it. The statistic that we all tend to quote and know is that women make something like 83 cents for every dollar a man makes. But it turns out the way that stat is calculated is rather just kind of back of the envelope. It's sort of like aggregate earnings by women divided by number of women, aggregate earnings by men. It's not very normalized. If you normalize it for the same level in the same company, it turns out there isn't much of a gap. It could be as small as 1.5%. It could be as high as maybe 8 or 9%.
Is that across the board, different industries, different jobs?
Yeah, it definitely varies more by some industries. But yeah, there's this graph from The Economist that did that. And they said, and then there's one, even in the Factual we just did it by sector. We didn't do it by level. So it's not complete. So it does, there is a disparity in different industries. And once you normalize by level, it gets a lot smaller. And there was a really interesting study that a couple of Harvard economists did in Boston looking at MBTA, which is Boston's transit authority. And they said, this is a nice controlled environment where we have, clear levels of hierarchy and promotion and wages. We should be able to tell if there's a gender pay gap. And it turns out that there is a gender pay gap. But when they dug deeper, most of it, or I think actually all of it, could be explained by the fact that men worked more hours and women did not. And so, of course, that begs the question, why?
Right. Did the men do overtime because the women had to go and pick their kids up from school?
That's exactly it. And so what the authors were concluding is it's not necessarily that the supervisors were discriminatory, but that women were basically doing the second job that they weren't paid for. That a lot of times childcare and home care would preclude them from doing extra hours and earning more. So if on a dollars and cents basis, it looks like the men were earning more. But if you really think about it, there's a whole bunch of unpaid labor that was happening on the women's side. So I thought that was a pretty good sort of understanding. But it's a multifaceted issue, as you've talked about before.
Yeah, and we saw during the pandemic, right, that, this was impacting women much more because women were ending up at home having to take care of kids or grandparents or, whatever, and not being able to work.
Yeah. This is definitely a big driver, I think, of the pay gap. The other ones, of course, are true that, women historically haven't been as aggressive in negotiations and asking for salary or promotion. So there are elements of those, but I think it's nice to tease apart the story and say it isn't always just hiring managers are sexist, mind you, but they are sometimes.
Though it definitely happens.
It does happen, and you and I were talking about this in some of the past jobs that Jill and I have worked at. There's an affinity sometimes to hire people like you who played on the same sports teams as you, went to the same schools as you.
Right, same fraternities,
Exactly.
whatever, right?
And so that invariably leads to a gap if you're hiring for some of the higher paying positions.
As well as just a sort of fear. I mean, women get asked who's going to take care of your kids when you have to work late or travel
That's
and
right.
so on and so forth, right? Men don't get asked that question.
That's right. Yeah. And I'm hoping, certainly having a daughter, I'm hoping that this changes in the next few decades. I think there's an important element of also sorting on what kinds of jobs women want to do and what kinds of jobs men want to do predominantly. And women tend to pick a lot of jobs that give them the flexibility to spend time with their families because they prioritize that more than men might. And so what does that translate to in terms of earnings that you see at the bottom line, your W-2 statement, for example? So it's a more complex topic than just a headline of 83 cents for every dollar a man makes kind of thing.
Right. It kind of makes me wonder, can you really legislate this, right? Just say, okay, we got to pay across the board because there are so many nuances, right? You give a woman a different title or a slightly different job or whatever, and then it doesn't show up on
Exactly. And what else happened this week that was big?
Well, so the other notable thing was this, sunshine retention. What do they call this bill?
I forget the name of the bill. Yeah, it's cute. But basically daylight savings, making it permanent.
We've been complaining about that for a long time, man. If you have kids and you need to wake them up in the morning for school, good riddance.
Yeah. Actually, so, just in case you guys all missed it, the Senate unanimously passed a bill to make daylight savings permanent in the United States.
Starting in 2023?
Is it 20? Yeah. Is it 23? Yeah.
Next year.
And so it's not a done deal yet because the House still has to pass it and then Biden has to sign it. It looks plausible that it would happen. But what I thought was really interesting, the backstory of this is how it happened. So, normally in the United States Senate, it's quite laborious to get anything done. You have to,
Which is maybe a good thing.
That's right. I mean, it's a ploddingly slow process, but that's democracy. And so, you have to get normally 60 votes if you're going to pass something, filibuster proof, or sometimes simple majority for certain kinds of bills. But then there's deliberation, and you have to ask the Senate Majority Leader to get floor time to even bring it to a vote, and all kinds of rigmarole. But it turns out that there's this one provision called unanimous consent, that you can put up anything you want and say, I'm seeking unanimous consent. And if no one objects, it's done. That's it. There's no debate. There's nothing.
Well, I guess that sort of makes sense because how often can you actually get unanimous consent in the
That's
Senate, right? It's amazing. I'm surprised that nobody objected to this.
So it turns out that a bunch of senators who normally would have opposed this didn't end up even knowing about it. They haven't officially said so, but Senator Tom Cotton has historically been against this. And so he just said no comment. But it's probable that his staff didn't notify him of this bill. And then there's a few other Republican senators who are also opposed to it. But basically, this got done and most people had no idea it got done.
What's their opposition to it? Do you know?
I do a little bit. So, if you think about people living at different latitudes, and so people in the northern states versus the southern states, it makes a bigger difference. In the northern states, when you don't have daylight savings, I think it basically ends up that kids are going to school in the dark and also coming back in the dark because you just have less daylight. So it makes for quite a miserable thing. I don't know if there's a safety concern as well when kids are going to school when it's pitch dark effectively. So they're like, we prefer not to have daylight savings then. Nonetheless, I think, assuming this goes through, it's quite the shocking change, actually. Oh, I did see a really funny quote about this on saying that the people who support making daylight savings permanent like low T activities, I think it's called, like basically drinking and chilling out. And people who are opposed to it are usually more morning people, high T sort of things, like get up, workout, exercise type people. I don't know if that's true, but it seems reasonably logical.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyways, an interesting quirk of U.S. Senate procedure, and it's sort of asking people, why don't we do this more often? But like you said, it's very, very rare.
Yeah, I wonder how many things we could actually, how many kinds of bills we could actually get unanimous consent on.
Well, basically, if the senators are not all on the floors, some legislative staffer has to notify them. and if they mess up, it goes through. It's pretty crazy. Maybe the last thing, of course, we've sort of consciously left this to the end is, of course, the biggest story always is the Ukraine war. And, in terms of new news, it's still sadly quite terrible news all the time. But the Ukrainian resistance still seemingly holding up, getting lots of arms from lots of NATO countries and non-NATO countries. Sweden actually is famously supplying arms to them, which is non-NATO.
Yeah.
The war continues. But maybe one of the interesting things that happened this week that people might not have caught up on is the knock-on effects of this war on so many things. The big one is wheat prices. Ukraine is a pretty big exporter of wheat. Actually, the United States and Russia are two of the biggest exporters. So U.S. and Russia, huge grain reserves. Ukraine's also pretty significant. And now, because of the war, grain futures have shot up, and people are saying, something like 12% of the output worldwide might be gone. Just a big deal.
Yeah.
And so if you're wondering, in Europe, especially in the Middle East, bread prices are going up a lot. Of course, that's quite the staple. So I thought that was an interesting point on how this is all going to connect back to us.
Yeah.
On the plus side, Australia and India had really good harvests, and both of them are quite good at grain production. So it's possible they could compensate. And ultimately, I think the thing that becomes really interesting for not just Americans, but really every nation, is the idea of food security is now going to become prominent. And you've already seen senators in the U.S. talking about it, but it's going to be everywhere saying, okay, if we really have to just feed our nation, can we do it? What are we dependent on? And, the U.S. actually has tremendous food production because it's extraordinarily mechanized. We export a lot.
We do.
A lot. I was looking it up. A lot of meat is exported from the United States to the Far East, China, Japan, etc. Like, American farmers really rely on global export markets.
Yeah. Well, and haven't there been times when our government, I think, has actually tried to get farmers to reduce with certain crops?
I don't remember.
I feel like there was something in the past.
Well, there's definitely there's another whole tangent on farm subsidies that encourage American farmers to sometimes overproduce certain things. So the most famous one is corn.
Right.
We produce way too much corn to the point that we've had to find new uses for corn.
Right.
So high fructose corn syrup is a function of that, and not wanting to import sugar from, back then it used to be Cuba, but really it's
which is one of probably the worst things that we've done for
our health.
For our health. And,
right.
Yeah.
Ethanol and adding corn to fuel is another thing. So there's some weird things on when we subsidize food and do it in the name of food security, but then it has these weird sort of tangential effects.
Yeah.
So maybe for anyone who's watching this, who's a pure free market type person, that is maybe good evidence that messing with the free market when it comes to crops and products can be really bad. But sort of understand both sides. Like, as a government, you're trying to say we don't want our citizens to ever starve in the event of war or something like that. So I can understand why they might do subsidies, but boy, what a tangled mess it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's a hard thing probably for our government to sort of legislate, right, and be smart about sort of all of those after effects.
Yeah, which is partly why I think, you think the Republican idea of small government, right? It's rooted in this idea that you can't sit in D.C. and correctly set all the guidelines and have it work in the country. You want as close to the ground as you can, making the decisions on whether to subsidize, and if so, on what crops and stuff, because only they would know supply and demand
right,
as well.
Which conceptually makes sense.
Right.
However, when it's abused.
Sure. Like everything else, it's a balance. But the idea of central planning of food, was historically shown to be really difficult by the Soviet Union. I mean, they really catastrophically bungled that. So it's tough to do it on a large scale across a nation as big as the United States.
But there's also certain things, certain like infrastructure, where it's been important at various points for them to do it centrally, right?
That's
like
right.
you wouldn't have highways going across the country
Correct.
without some kind of central
Correct.
planning.
Yeah, that's the thing about the more that you understand U.S. policy and maybe read news from all the different angles, you realize that you actually want this very delicate balance. That you want some central control, but not too much. And if you don't have enough, then you get like highways that don't connect to anyone, or you get like patches of highway no one wants to take care of. So you need some central, but if you have too much, then you also get stupid pork belly projects with like bridges to nowhere. So it's such a it's why you want tension in the U.S. government. Like tension is good.
Yeah.
Disagreement and debate is actually good. It's what's needed for functioning.
When it's done healthily.
Correct.
Right?
When it's not
and
done
respectfully.
Right. And by the way, incidentally, coming back to the daylight savings, this unanimous consent thing, it's apparently often used just as a way to sort of get press. Like, I put it up there, and of course I got shot down, so now I'll go through this. And I say this because sometimes I feel like the debate with politicians has turned into a performative aspect sometimes. And everything's on social, and you see little sound bites and clips, and pick your favorite politician, whether it's on the left or the right, they all do it. And it's quite unfortunate, because really the job of legislating and doing government is quite dull.
Yep.
There are not supposed to be very many sound bites.
Well, and, we've seen in the past, right? I remember this, I think, John Kerry was sort of famous for this, right? As soon as any politician tries to get into the nuances and the gray areas and explain things, like that's over with. It's the charisma and it's the sound bites that gets them elected.
Yeah.
And so they've learned that that's how they need to behave if they want their job.
That's right. And of course, sadly, the desire to be re-elected drives so much behavior as well. So a bit of a tangent, but hopefully we see more healthy debate in our government in the coming weeks, especially with lots of other bills up for debate.
Yeah, we can keep open.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We'll see you next week on Factual Fridays. Bye.
Good week.